Let's start with an uncomfortable truth that almost always gets buried under speeches, press conferences, and moral framing. When a country with no strategic value collapses, the world expresses concern. When a country with massive strategic assets collapses, the world pays attention. Venezuela falls squarely into the second category, and today, with Nicolás Maduro captured and removed from power, that distinction suddenly matters a lot more than most people are willing to admit. Officially, this moment is not about oil. It is about law enforcement. It is about narcotics. It is about accountability. It is about restoring order. And of course, it is never about oil, except that Venezuela happens to sit on the largest proven oil reserves on Earth. An awkward coincidence, again. Venezuela's proven oil reserves are estimated at roughly 300 billion barrels, according to figures cited by OPEC and widely reported by Reuters and other international outlets. That number places Venezuela ahead of Saudi Arabia, ahead of Iran, ahead of everyone. On paper, Venezuela should be one of the most powerful energy producers in the world. In reality, it is not. And that gap between potential and reality is precisely why Venezuela's oil matters, especially now. Because oil is not only valuable when it is flowing, it is valuable when it can be unlocked later. To understand why this matters to the United States, we need to separate three concepts that are often confused: reserves, production, control. Venezuela has enormous reserves. Its production has collapsed, and control over the system has been unstable for years. These three facts coexist, and that coexistence is rare. In the early 2010s, Venezuela was producing more than 2.5 million barrels per day. Its oil industry, while already politicized, still functioned at scale. Over the following decade, production declined dramatically. By recent estimates, Venezuela has been producing well under 1 million barrels per day, with fluctuations depending on sanctions enforcement, infrastructure failures, and operational constraints. This collapse was not caused by a single factor. It was the cumulative result of underinvestment, loss of technical expertise, corruption, sanctions, equipment degradation, and a state oil company that gradually lost the ability to operate efficiently. None of this is disputed. Now here's where things become strategically interesting. Even at reduced production levels, Venezuelan oil never stopped being relevant to the United States. Why? Because relevance is not the same as dependence. The U.S. does not need Venezuelan oil to survive, but it benefits from having options. An energy strategy is, at its core, about optionality. Before sanctions were tightened, the United States imported significant volumes of Venezuelan crude. According to data from the Congressional Research Service in 2017, Venezuelan oil accounted for roughly 8% of total U.S. crude oil imports. That was not an act of goodwill. It was a logistical decision. Venezuelan crude is heavy. Many U.S. Gulf Coast refineries are designed to process heavy crude. Compatibility matters. Refineries cannot simply switch feedstock without cost, time, and efficiency losses. This made Venezuelan oil particularly suitable for certain segments of the U.S. refining system. When sanctions escalated, those flows were cut. But cutting flows does not eliminate the asset, it freezes it. And frozen assets create leverage for whoever controls the conditions under which they can be reactivated. This is the first reason Venezuela's oil matters to the U.S. after Maduro's capture. Not because oil will suddenly flood the market, not because prices will collapse overnight, but because the future of that supply just became a live strategic question again. Now let's talk about timing. The capture of a sitting president is not a routine political event. It is a systemic shock. Shocks reset expectations. They reopen negotiations that were previously frozen. They force institutions to reassess assumptions. They create moments where long-term assets re-enter strategic planning. Oil does not need to be the motive for this moment to become central after it. And today, it clearly has. Almost immediately following Maduro's removal, reporting and official statements began referencing the possibility of U.S. companies participating in the reconstruction of Venezuela's oil infrastructure. This is not speculation. This language appeared quickly and publicly. That alone tells us something important. Oil was not an afterthought. Now let's be precise. Saying that oil matters does not mean saying oil caused the capture. Those are different claims. What we can verify is that Venezuela has the world's largest proven oil reserves. Its production capacity is severely degraded. Its oil infrastructure is damaged but largely intact. U.S. companies have historical experience operating there. Oil reconstruction is already being discussed in the aftermath. Those are facts. They do not require conspiracy. They do not require hidden documents. They require only observation. Let's talk about infrastructure. One detail that stood out in reporting today is that major oil infrastructure was not deliberately destroyed during the strikes. Military bases were hit. Defense installations were damaged. But oil facilities appear to have been largely spared. This matters, because infrastructure destruction is often unavoidable in conflict, unless it is actively avoided. Preserving infrastructure does not prove intent, but it aligns with future utility. If oil were irrelevant, protecting infrastructure would not be a priority. Another critical element is sanctions. Sanctions are often framed as punishment. In reality, they are filters. They determine who can operate, under what rules, at what scale, and with whose permission. Sanctions can be tightened, they can be relaxed, they can be restructured, and when political conditions change, sanctions often change with them. That makes oil suddenly actionable again. Now let's address a common reaction. But the U.S. is already the world's largest oil producer. Why would Venezuelan oil matter? Because energy security is not just about volume. It is about diversity of supply, type of crude, refinery compatibility, geopolitical optionality. U.S. shale is flexible, but it is also capital-intensive and sensitive to price cycles. Heavy crude supply is more limited globally. Venezuela fits into that equation in a way few countries do. There is also a historical dimension. The U.S.-Venezuela oil relationship did not begin recently. For decades, Venezuelan oil flowed into the U.S. U.S. companies invested capital and expertise. Supply chains developed around that relationship. Those systems do not disappear completely. They go dormant, and dormant systems can be reactivated faster than new ones can be built. Now let's talk about incentives. Countries rarely invest political capital, sanctions regimes, and international credibility into places that offer nothing in return. Humanitarian concerns matter, legal concerns matter, security concerns matter, but strategic assets amplify attention. They always have. This is not cynicism, it is history. Another reason oil matters now is global context. Energy security has returned to the center of geopolitics. Supply disruptions, sanctions, conflicts, realignment of trade flows. In that environment, countries reassess assets they previously ignored or sidelined. Venezuela's oil is one of those assets. It is also important to emphasize what this does not mean. It does not mean oil prices will immediately fall. It does not mean Venezuela will suddenly become a reliable supplier. It does not mean reconstruction will be quick or easy. Reviving Venezuela's oil industry would take years of investment, massive capital inflows, skilled labor returning, political stability, functional institutions. None of those conditions exist yet, which makes this a long-term strategic story, not a short-term market one. That long-term nature is precisely why oil matters now, because strategic planning happens early, long before barrels move. Now consider this. With Maduro gone, the central political barrier that froze many discussions has been removed. That does not guarantee success, but it changes the conversation. Who governs? Who controls PDVSA? Who negotiates contracts? Who sets terms? These questions are now open, and oil sits at the center of every one of them. There is also the issue of legitimacy. Any future government in Venezuela will need revenue. Oil is the only realistic source of that revenue at scale. Without oil, there is no reconstruction. Without oil, there is no currency stability. Without oil, there is no fiscal capacity. This makes oil not just an economic issue, but a political one. Let's talk about risk. Oil assets attract attention, not just from governments, but from private interests, criminal networks, and opportunistic actors. In unstable environments, control over oil infrastructure becomes a power struggle. This is why the coming months are critical. Who controls the asset? Who secures it? Who administers it? Those answers will shape Venezuela's trajectory. Another underappreciated factor is perception. For years, Venezuela was framed as a lost cause, an isolated system, a sanctioned state with no realistic path forward. Today, that perception has shifted, not because problems disappeared, but because barriers changed. Perception alone can redirect capital, interest, and diplomatic energy. Oil accelerates that shift. Now let's address the sarcasm everyone is thinking. but rarely says out loud. Yes, it is always a coincidence. Yes, it is always framed as something else. Yes, oil is never the headline until it suddenly is. This does not mean oil explains everything. It means oil explains why attention persists. There is one more critical element. Oil is not just a commodity, it is a systemic input. It affects currency flows, it affects trade balances, it affects geopolitical alignment. Venezuela's oil does not operate in isolation, it connects to everything else. So when people ask, why does Venezuela's oil matter to the US now? The honest answer is not dramatic. It is structural, because Venezuela has something the world still values, because that asset was frozen, because political conditions changed, because reconstruction requires revenue, because energy security matters again. None of that requires speculation. Today is not the day oil returns to the market. Today is the day oil re-enters strategic planning. That distinction matters. The capture of a president closes one chapter. It opens many others. And beneath all of them, quietly shaping incentives and decisions, lies an asset that has defined Venezuela's history for a century. Oil does not explain everything, but it explains why Venezuela is never just another crisis. And especially today, it explains why the United States is paying attention.